Books.
Manga.
Unlimited power.
These are the three things we have to offer. It's up to you if you want to accept them. Welcome back to the series where we recommend some of the good stuff we've been reading over the last couple months and occasionally issue some dire warnings of what to avoid.
I'm Kat, that's Dennis, and without further ado, let's get into some manga.
The Dark Continent and the Succession War arcs of Hunter x Hunter have not been adapted in anime form yet, and so they were the last remaining pieces of this story that I had not yet consumed, and my god, am I so glad I finally arrived at these storylines. The events following the chairman election arc feels like Hunter x Hunter has entered a completely new stage. No longer is Gon the central protagonist, no longer is the story about finding Jean, or the adventures of children growing up to find themselves. Hunter x Hunter transforms from Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z with a tonal and perspective shift that keeps the storytelling engaging, surprising, and even more grand and mysterious than ever before. I won't get into any spoilers here, but I have been loving everything that I've read of these story arcs. I think that one can definitely lob a complaint that the manga has become too wordy. I definitely find myself struggling to follow every detail that's going on without rereading certain sections, so I won't fight you on that criticism. However, I think that the world building and storytelling on display is so interesting that I'm willing to give it a pass. From Jean and Pariston's rivalry, to Hisoka and Crollo's fight in Heaven's Arena, to Kurapika's quest to keep a group of princes from slaughtering each other while trapped on a sea voyage to a disturbingly magical land beyond the known world, Hunter x Hunter continues to deliver in ways only Hunter x Hunter can. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a new chapter of the manga published in years, and so the Succession War arc isn't complete, nor does it seem to be anywhere near complete. However, if you are a fan of this series, and you have not read these chapters, I do recommend them. They've definitely given me a lot to love and appreciate. You won't get the closure that you might want, but you'll definitely get some big payoffs that you may have felt were missing from the material adapted into the anime. Overall, I cannot recommend these chapters enough. Shoha Shoten follows two 16-year-old boys, both obsessed with comedy and making others smile, who want to be comedians. That doesn't sound like the setup for a typical Shonen Jump title, and yet it works perfectly with a chaotic energy, well-scripted narrative, and the conflict and stakes to keep the reader invested. Azamichi is an anonymous up-and-coming comedy writer who suffers from terrible stage fright, while Taiyo is an airheaded goofball with the worst instincts in the world, but on stage, he is a master performer. They team up to become the best comedy duo in the world. Shoha Shoten is unlike any manga I've ever read before, which isn't saying much since I've read less than a dozen titles at this point, but it's been a breath of fresh air for me. I started reading this one because the artist who drew Death Note was attached, and I mean, look at this art. The title only releases monthly, so the artist can take his time, which is vital for this story since so much of it relies on visual comedy. However, the writing is what has me hooked. At the time of this recording, there are only 5 chapters available, each more than double the size of the typical manga chapter, and they are stuffed full of great character writing. Perfectly set up conflicts for the characters to overcome, with insightful analysis on the inner workings of the comedy world, and downright funny stage routines that have me smiling along as I read. I cannot express to you how impressed I am with the writing on display in every chapter. Somehow, a manga about 2 teenagers doing sketches on stage has sucked me in, and I want much more of this story. If you are looking to jump into a new title that you won't have to binge for months just to catch up on, and a well-written story that's sure to make you smile, then I highly recommend you check out Shoha Shoten. Finally, a quick update on the titles I've continued reading since our last video. PPP continues to be a nice story with fantastic art that I appreciate more with each chapter. I cannot get over how unique the clothing design is for this manga. It gives you something to appreciate with each page, which then swells into even more impressive art whenever there's a big set piece during someone's piano performance. The story is progressing well. It has lost a bit of the quick-paced excitement the initial chapters had for me, but I think for the story to continue for a while, it did need a bit of a reorientation. So far, I am still enjoying the journey of Lucky Sonata. The winter chapters of Dragon Ball Super have been fairly entertaining, mixing up a good deal of the Super formula by giving the spotlight to a character who isn't Goku or Vegeta. The Granola the Survivor arc seems to be nearing its climax, and while it isn't the most innovative story Dragon Ball has ever told, it feels like a fun side adventure with some more visually interesting action that keeps the fighting feeling more dynamic. Granola is a likable enough protagonist, Gas brings some new powers into the mix which makes for unique action sequences, and Elec remains a standout antagonist for me. Here's hoping this arc can stick the landing.
So I actually wanted to start with more of a review than a recommendation because, to be totally honest, I didn't love this book, but I think there are elements of it that can definitely be appreciated, and the content alone may actually be enough to pique your interest. This is a book called Night Bitch by Rachel Yoder, and I had been looking forward to reading this for months before it was even published. The story follows a young mother who used to be a successful, acclaimed artist, but has fallen into a monotonous, drab routine since giving birth to her son. Her days center around his physical needs and primitive whims, which she caters to wholly without resistance, until she has completely lost her sense of individuality and personal needs and interests. That is, until one day when she begins her transformation into Night Bitch, the carnal dog that roams the streets at night, killing small animals and rolling naked in the dirt. Now, I love speculative fiction, especially when it's creepy to the point of discomfort, so this concept seemed like it was going to be a home run on paper. However, Yoder's descriptions of the narrator's canine alter ego gave me more cringy secondhand embarrassment than anything else. Perhaps the freedom of throwing all social norms to the wind was the point of this discomfort. However, it honestly made me like the character a lot less. Her scenes were also extremely repetitive, and it felt like I was reading the same chapters over and over again. When Night Bitch would go out and roam the streets of the neighborhood, do a bunch of dog stuff, and then come home completely unnoticed. This repetition makes sense in the context of the narrator's regular human day-to-day, but when applied to her time as Night Bitch, it felt super boring and anticlimactic. I like that this book brings to light the rough, primal, often undignified foundation that is motherhood, a violent and instinctive phenomenon that is literally prehistoric. And Yoder does a great job of depicting a certain loneliness and longing to motherhood, particularly a longing for yourself, before you became a natural resource for food and care and love. I just wish she had taken the story on a darker, more sinister path where the narrator descends into complete madness and there are actual consequences. Instead, the story feels a little bit one note and is full of overused stereotypes about suburban middle-aged moms, which is boring. I think this book would be a fun read for someone who wants to dip their toe into speculative fiction, but if you're a seasoned veteran like me, I would steer clear.
Dune Messiah is the sequel to the 1965 classic by Frank Herbert, Dune. Released in 1969, this story follows the life of protagonist Paul Atreides 12 years after the events of the first book, and details his rule as Emperor of the Universe following the success of the Free Man's Jihad. Where Dune was more of an atypical hero's journey, Dune Messiah is an interesting character study of what happens when that hero achieves everything that he set out to do. What happens when the hero becomes a larger-than-life religious figure, and how does this veneration of heroes unite and further divide people? In the foreword to my edition of this novel, Frank Herbert's son, Brian, details that upon the release of Dune Messiah, it was a critical failure. The first line of this introduction is, Dune Messiah is the most misunderstood of all Frank Herbert's novels. People wanted a continuation of Paul's heroic exploits and messianic feats, but this sequel is essentially a damnation of over-relying on the strong men of history and how their charismatic leadership can lead to the destruction of societies. I really love this novel. I liked Dune when I first read it, but Dune Messiah is just excellent. It is unlike anything that I've read before, and perfectly reframes the first novel in a way that makes me enjoy the story more than when I first read it. Herbert does a great job of capturing an aged and jaded Paul, the Emperor of the Universe and a near omnipotent being who struggles to hold onto the virtues that he claims to uphold while fighting off a conspiracy in his court that threatens the lives of those he holds closest to him. This novel also does a great job of introducing a new supporting cast of interesting characters, while bringing back some important figures from the first novel that all serve a distinct purpose in shaping the events of this story, even if they don't seem clear-cut at first. I don't want to spoil any more than I have, so if you enjoyed Dune and you've never continued the series, I highly recommend this sequel. It has gotten me interested in reading the entire Dune saga.
Up next on the list is another spooky story, as I've clearly been going through a phase. Perfume, the Story of a Murderer by Patrick Susskind was originally published in Germany in 1985. If you're a Nirvana fan, you may recognize this as the book that Kurt Cobain kept on his person and had apparently read over 10 times. And I really don't blame him because this book slaps. As I've said before, I'm a sucker for lyrical descriptive imagery, which authors tend to harness through sight and sometimes sound. This book, on the other hand, blew me away with its endlessly unique descriptions of scenes through smell. If that sounds weird, let me explain the plot. Jean-Baptiste Grenouille is a child born in Paris in 1738 and is subsequently orphaned when his mother is hanged for infanticide. Grenouille is the first of his mother's 5 children to survive, which isn't even the most special thing about him. As it turns out, Grenouille has probably the strongest, most accurate sense of smell in human history, and he can sense a visitor walking toward his home from a great distance and can smell money hidden behind walls. His primary language is olfactory, and he essentially learns to experience the world through his sense of smell, storing each scent in his memory and creating impossible combinations in his mind that have never even been experienced in person before, many that don't even exist. This makes him a very odd character who cannot function socially in the same way as others, and it's clear that he has a much darker side to him. Eventually, he begins apprenticing for an esteemed perfumer, but finds that the darker side of him emerges as he searches for the perfect scent to trump all others. The descriptions in this book are unlike anything I've ever read before. Not only do you experience such a wide variety of scent-based sensations, but Susskind does a fantastic job of harnessing the power of olfactory memory. I love that this book encapsulates a full spectrum of reader comfort, both in its descriptions and its content. You have the illustrations of disgusting, horrifying scenes filled with all of the lovely elements of 18th century Paris, like raw sewage and extremely specific body odors and corpses, juxtaposed with the most gorgeous descriptions of herbs and flowers and pastries. The complexity of the writing, plus the uniquity of the style, plus the gritty tension and drama of the story make it ridiculously special, and I totally agree with Kurt Cobain on this one. Go read it.
Story is a book that probably isn't for everyone watching this video, but was of great interest to me. Robert McKee is a screenwriting lecturer and consultant who has worked with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, and his educational seminar is a rite of passage for some of the most successful screenwriters. You can look into Robert McKee yourself, but the point is, he's an influential man in the writing world, and this book is an expansion on his famous 3-day screenwriting seminar. I found this book to be really insightful and a must-read for anyone with aspirations to be a writer of any kind, not just for screen, or for those who are interested in what goes into crafting a well-told story. McKee breaks down everything that goes into creating a script, from the elements of story, such as structure and character, the principles of story design, such as scene composition, and the craft of writing, such as developing meaningful forces of antagonism, all while using real-world examples and vivid detail to get his points across. As someone who's worked within the Hollywood system for decades, and an obvious, unabashed fan of cinema, McKee has a near encyclopedic knowledge of not just what works, but why it works. I found this book to be very helpful in my own continuing education to better my writing, and I strongly recommend it for other aspiring writers out there.
I'll keep this last one short because this particular title seems to be a little hard to come by in the United States, but if you can get your hands on a copy, I highly recommend it. The book is called There Were No Windows by Nora Holt, and it's based on the last few years of the real-life writer Violet Hunt, or Claire Temple in the book, who was once a glamorous British socialite, but later suffered from dementia while living through the Blitz in London. It's written from Claire's perspective as she fluctuates between different levels of confusion and attempts to navigate her surroundings, which only grow more frightening every day, both outside of her home and inside of her head. This novel is a somber look into how poorly dementia patients were treated in this era, which is especially bad considering the fact that Claire is still wealthy, can afford caretakers, and was not institutionalized. It also offers a speculative look into the mind of someone with this condition, and offers a bit of perspective as to why Claire lashes out and behaves in the way that she does. Though it deals with matters that are quite sad, it also offers a black humor based around Claire's pompous and snobby attitude left over from her younger days. The writing is clever and multifaceted, and I constantly found myself thinking back on previous chapters and realizing the underlying truth behind the confusion that I had experienced alongside the narrator. The book is truly beautiful, and I especially recommend it if you have a loved one that is memory impaired like I do, because it really gave me a much better understanding of their world. And that's the video. Have you read anything we discuss? Has anything piqued your interest? Are you aware of what reading is? Please let us know your thoughts and anything else you'd recommend reading in the comments.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. We really appreciate it. And until the next time, we'll shut up.